Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhary. Thank you for watching Inquiry. One of the problems of our public life today in India or anywhere in the world is that we live in such a polarized atmosphere that depending on where you stand, you feel one side is airbrushing the truth and the other side is exaggerating it. A good case in point is that a few episodes earlier in Inquiry, I spoke to two former finance ministers of India, Mr. Yashwant Sinha and Mr. P. Chidambaram. Both were very critical of the relief and stimuli package that's been designed by the Modi government in response to the COVID crisis and the lockdowns. On the other hand, over the last couple of days, we've heard the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Railway Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal, speak of how well the government has done in handling the crisis, both in terms of lives and livelihoods. How do we break out of these soundproof rooms that we live in? One good way is to try and create conversations that talk across aisles. And so I'm particularly delighted to introduce our guest at Inquiry today, Mr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice President of Niti Aayog and a respected economist. He's been deeply involved in the consultative process with the government that went into designing the relief and stimuli package. So, did they do well? In retrospect, with introspection, were there things that they could do better? And what is the thinking that is going to drive India in the months forward? To discuss all of that, once again, I'm delighted to introduce Rajiv Kumar. Thank you so much for being with us, Rajiv.
Yeah, good. Welcome. Great pleasure to be here, Shoma.
To start with, Rajiv, I'd like to say that it's been a very difficult time for anyone in government, many difficult decisions to be made. But still, as the primary think tank of the government, do you think that there were things that really could have been done much better?
With 2020 hindsight, you can always find ways to do things better, because you're always learning your lessons and you always, but, standing, where we were on the 24th of March, we have done the best that we could under the circumstance. The Prime Minister was leading from the front. And I remember that at that point of time, in the end of March, we were shown some projections done by the Boston Consulting Group, John Hopkins University, which had put the figure for infections in India at about 10 lakhs, by the end of May. I think compared to all of that, we've done very well. The other issue, that's about lives in some sense, but about the livelihoods, I think, again, except for the migrant situation, which blew up quite unexpectedly, because what the government had done and tried to do was to give the states enough resources. I think right up front, 13,000 crore were transferred to the states so that they could come up with their own quarantine facilities and all the help that they could give to the NGOs and so on to keep the migrants in place. I think that's there somewhere between the central, state, and the local governments that can be handled. But otherwise, the rest of it, if you notice, hasn't been that bad at all.
So, Rajiv, you brought up two things we'll focus on first, which is the impact or the decision of the full-scale lockdown, and the second is the migrant issue. Let's go with the migrant issue first. You just said that you'd allocated around 13,000 crore to the states. By your own statistic, there are about 38 million migrant workers. Do you think 13,000 crore was enough to take care of people who really living very precariously and on a daily wage? Overnight, that daily wage is taken away from them. 13,000 crores seems an extremely small amount, doesn't it?
Nobody was taken off the rolls right away. I mean, that's not fair to say. And secondly, we had expected the states to come up with their own resources. Third, this was just a part of the resources that was being transferred. There were the monies, that about 18,000 crore, which went to the farmers. There was 40,000 crore, which went into the expansion of the Manrega.
But Rajiv, those are later, and farmers are not migrant workers.
At the time when this was allocated, the migrant situation, as I said to you, was not anticipated. Expectation was that they will remain in place. And then, by the way, a big step was taken in making sure that NGOs were empowered and authorized and given access to subsidized food. The fact is that all of them have been provided that subsistence all this time.
Actually,
And
in terms of
honestly, Shoma, I don't know what we will get out of this line of inquiry.
that is many ways the most crucial line of inquiry, because I think actually successive governments it's been a blind spot, the precariousness of workers as well as the large scale of it. And right now, the kind of humanitarian crisis we've seen, I think it's very important to focus on that, so that no successive government ever forgets that such a large swath of people were really overlooked in its planning.
You see, there I can't disagree more. They were not overlooked, but the scale of it was clearly not anticipated. And the expectation was that the state governments would also play their role. And unfortunately, after all of these years, there isn't enough data. There isn't enough, nothing much is known. We don't know where they were, how they were, and so on. But as soon as the scale was known, the first step that the government did take was to take care of them when they would reach their homes. Let it be said that we need now to take steps to do away with this duality of the informal and the formal sector. That's the line to focus on. How can we have 90% of our workers under the radar, where we don't know what their working conditions are, what their social safety nets are, what their wages, what the minimum wages are, etc., etc. And that's where I think our trade union movement, plus the governments, plus the state government, all of us now have to work together to make sure that this category of informal workers, this level of informalization, does not remain going forward.
Cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
That's an important point, but it's been quite distressing that in response to seeing this gigantic humanitarian crisis, we've had the UP government, the Madhya Pradesh government, and the Gujarat government respond by actually abolishing all labor laws with an ordinance. And that's not just doing away with what was excessive about the license Raj, but removing all safety nets.
I've said it publicly that this cannot be the response of any government which is a signatory to the ILO conventions. And I'm happy to note that the Ministry of Labour and the central government has come out clearly and said that they are preparing their own response, or they're preparing their own position to make it clear that the government of India does not support any of these measures about abolition of labor laws, as it were, because that cannot be. That's not the way to go forward. The other, the thing is that we still can't, I don't think, figure out whether the movement of the migrants was due to the loss of economic livelihood and anticipated loss, or was it due to the fact of the scare, the health scare, and not because of the economic livelihood, because that was being taken care of.
But Rajiv, we can all only go anecdotally with what one is seeing, with the stories that journalists have been covering. And there, a lot of people have been speaking about, yes, the fear and wanting to die with your loved ones if necessary, but also acute lack of food, lack of money, the fact that they were thrown out of their accommodations, they didn't have money for rent. And I'd just like to come back to this a little bit more. When you said enough was being done to at least mitigate the immediate hunger and livelihood of these workers, what has been very difficult to understand is this figure of rupees 500 that was allocated in the beginning to women with Jan Dhan accounts, and even to farmers. If you break up 2,000, which was advanced, that's again 500 rupees a month. Even if you go by the fact that daily wagers may be earning 15 days of work in a month, on an average with 250 rupees as a daily wage, just on an average ballpark, it's about 5,000-6,000 rupees a month. Suddenly that livelihood is taken away from them, and it is replaced by 500 rupees a month for a family, not even per person. Can you help me understand the maths of that? How is that enough?
I can't say anything more than what has been said already. And I think I would, in this particular instance, Shoma, I would rather not get into the maths or the numbers, etc., because I don't know whether this will take us anywhere to understand or to improve the situation that we are facing. The only thing I can say is that there is a sense of fiscal responsibility, which this government has always worked with. We are not in the business of, overshooting our targets to the extent that that can cause harm later. So we have to cut our coat according to the cloth we have.
Allow me to persist a little bit with that.
I will not answer any longer.
Okay, but just in terms of the larger point, that can there be any fiscal responsibility which is divorced from the well-being of 90% or 80% or let's even say 30% of your country?
Not at all, and that I think is the spurious charge being made. So the government and the governments have been very conscious and cognizant of the lives and the well-being of the people, and to that extent, one should be thankful that we've not had any sort of calamitous outcomes, and people have been taken care of. And I think, and we should in some sense be lauding the efforts that have been made by various constituents of our society, including the government as well as the civil society organizations, rather than keep harping about the fact of the distress that has been caused, which is undeniable.
So that's a tall ask. I mean, of course, one is, there are aspects of the relief and stimuli that people have lauded. But when you see visibly such a gigantic humanitarian crisis, I think it's worth drawing attention to the fact that if one thought, and the government is repeatedly, different ministers from the finance minister to the PM's letter on completing 6 years, there's a great sense that enough has been done. And yet, if you're not able to explain the logic of 500 rupees, it does leave a kind of gap in comprehension for those who are watching that unfold, So let's come to, if you're not willing to discuss the money that's been allocated, let's just focus a little bit on the food, Rajiv. Definitely enough grain has been given out. I saw a figure of 80 crore Indians who have apparently had access to 5 kilos of rice per person, or wheat per person, and that seems sufficient, but no one actually only lives on rice. So the other very inexplicable number has been giving 1 kilogram of chana per family per month. What explains that?
What would be your ideal mix of food packets that would have been delivered?
What I can say, not even being an economist, is that no family can survive on 1 kilo of chana per month. And that is exactly why economists across the political spectrum and even across ideological spectrum have been urging the government to release more money for immediate relief. It's not long term. It's not that you can do it for a year, but to mitigate immediate crisis. So I would put the question back to you, Rajiv.
There was rice, there was wheat, there was sugar. All of those things were being given. I don't know why would you insisting on there's 1 kilogram of sugar. That was not the only thing that was being provided. But and the fact remains that, and this is you use the word gigantic more than once. Do you know the number of migrants estimated by a professor in Center of Development Studies Trivandrum is about close to 100 million, of which I don't think more than 10 million have moved. I think even that number is very hard to come by, because if you add up all the trains that have moved and all the people who've been on the road, etc., it's a much, much smaller number. The 90% of the migrants are where they were, and they've been taken care of. I think it's people who, for whatever biases, and some very well-meaning people like you, who've just blown this out of proportion.
Okay. So the part of the stimuli package that has got universal kind of applause is the fact that 40,000 crore has been added to the NREGA budget. And if 100 lakh people have gone back to the villages, there definitely needs to be hard thinking about that. The question I'd like to ask Rajiv, that initially the NREGA would have been designed for a certain number of people. Now when almost, it varies, you're saying it's 10 million people. There are other estimates which say 20 million have gone back.
You do the totting up, and it's not very difficult. The number of trains that have moved, the number of passengers per train, etc., it cannot be more than 10. By no stretch of imagination, probably much less.
Yeah, I'm going by Mr. Amit Shah, as Home Minister. He's put out some figures. He says 50 lakh have gone back so far as
5
on
million.
trains and 40 lakh by buses. And there's still many more that want to go back. So the 10 million number has already been crossed. And I'll give you one figure, which is the Gujarat government's own labor report, which says that Surat had 11.5 lakh migrant workers, of which 10 lakh workers have gone back and only 1.5 lakh workers are remaining around Surat.
That's a million people who have gone back.
Million people from one city, around one city, one center.
No, but that could well have been a city which had money more to go back to because they didn't have, any quasi-permanent or permanent, boards. But in other cities, there would have been that.
But anyway, I wasn't quibbling over the numbers. Let's go with the Home Minister's numbers. As of now, 10 million have gone back to the villages. The question I was asking is that the Narega was designed for a certain number of people. If 10 million more go back, is there enough work to absorb that? Will that work be designed? And if they don't get that work, if there isn't enough work to absorb them, will they still get assured wages?
Yeah, so the latter part of the question is, we can keep it aside for a while because the fact is that the first part of the question is a great one, that they would need more work and therefore, in my view, the scope of Narega should be expanded and should be expanded very rapidly. I think this is where the Ministry of Rural Development and the Ministry of Labour should come in with the state government, to make sure that Narega can be used for construction, real estate, or infrastructure projects, whatever. So I think you're right. The scope of Narega has to be redefined and redesigned.
So has that instruction been given already?
I'm not sure. I cannot say that. You're a think tank, remember? You're not a line ministry.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so very, very important pillar that you have identified, this urbanization of rural economy. What are the 2 or 3 big recommendations you've given the government on that?
Not yet. I've just started thinking through that. But the one big one that we have given is that you can, just to restart the economy, is for a massive drive for slum rehabilitation and workers' accommodation, public housing, and public housing not just in metros, but also in tier 3, tier 4 cities, because that's where the borderline is between the villages and that's the urban area that you've got. And I think if we can do that there, then a lot of workers who work in peri-urban or urban centers but go back to the rural home after the day's work, that could stop, and they could be absorbed in this. So, and that would then restart also the economic activity in a significant manner.
So, the original idea of Narega, whatever the efficacy with which it was done, but seems a really big zone of focus would be to create water infrastructure, because we have such a big water crisis in the country that this is a good time actually to look at rural infrastructure in terms of just water structures and water security.
Perfect idea. Very good. Thank you. And I know of certain organizations which are doing something like that. For example, the Jain Sangathan or something like that. And they could be given funds from Narega to make, to absorb people, and create all the water conservation.
So let's shift to the issue of loans, because, with the kind of fiscal responsibility the governments wanted to maintain, a lot of the stimuli has been in terms of creating a better loan structure for MSMEs especially. We already had a situation where in the past you said it was in fact unprecedented in the 70 years of India's history that there was such reluctance on the part of the banks to give loans. Now, the burden of actually creating a stimuli in the economy has been passed on to banks, and for an MSME sector that traditionally has not always taken formal loans. So 2 questions. One is that do you think the banks have the bandwidth to process the kind of loans that you are foreseeing people will take? And number 2, when you, as government, you yourself don't know when the economy will restart, how are entrepreneurs supposed to feel secure enough to seek loans? And how will banks even assess whether those projects are loan worthy or not?
I mean, with the kind of economic shutdown, as it were, it's very clear that lots of MSMEs would have, what are called working capital requirements to meet their fixed costs, to keep some of the labor in place, etc. And with the loss of revenue, it's very clear to them that this can be overcome best by taking extra credit, from the banking sector at subsidized rates. It is not very difficult for the MSMEs to estimate their initial requirements of credit. Now, nobody is expecting them to take credit to expand their capacity to meet, as it were, rising demand, because they would first have to come back. They would first have to sustain themselves, and then to come back to normal capacity utilization before any of that further expansion would come. And this would happen as the economic activity restarts. So the question there in the minds of everybody was to prevent the cash crunch from converting itself to insolvency. And therefore, what was the idea simply was to replace lost liquidity with credit, and credit which was guaranteed by the central government. Now, for the banks themselves, it is not very difficult it is not very difficult to assess, who are loan worthy or not, because there are at least, I think, about 5.5 million, MSME accounts which they are lending to already, and they can see those on their books, and they can, as I said, estimate the working capital requirement because of the loss of revenue that they have, plus a 50,000 crore fund of funds where MSMEs could also dip into and use that for building their equity and not just debt. Now, the large number of micro and small enterprises have never had access to banking credit, and the idea there is that they would, and for example, there are about 50 million or 5 million vendors for whom the 10,000 rupees were earmarked.
Again, I mean, of course, these are uncomfortable points to press on. But the point I was trying to drive home is that many more than 5 million live outside the net of the formal banking sector. So by providing loans via banks, how are we touching, again, this vast catchment who are not part of the formal economy? How are we touching those that we have not touched already?
Again, Shoma, you can't possibly change the whole system, the whole structure of an economy in the midst of a pandemic. I mean, these are systemic, structural, historical legacy questions that we are facing. This government has started the process of at least putting a social safety net under the traders and the micro, small, and medium enterprises. This wasn't there. We have started the process of trying to get at least a hang of at a database on all of these things. But these things, they have remained, as it were, for 70 years, in some sense, just below every policy radar.
So I just wanted to come to the next issue, which is of numbers. Already before COVID hit, there was anxiety about just data credibility with the, particularly with the Modi government. And again, I'll put the caveat that it's a difficult country. It's difficult to arrive at numbers, but already there was, arguments over what was the unemployment rate in the country. The labor reports had been suppressed. Now, there are two facts that I would like to bring up. One is on the MSME loans itself. The central government had said that what was owed to MSMEs was to the tune of around 10,000 crore. Mr. Nitin Gadkari, who's the MSME minister, said that it was 5 lakh crore. That's a vastly different number. Which is the more reliable number?
We'll have to ask the MSME or the MOSPI. Niti Aayog hasn't looked into it, but we know, for example, that there is a certain volume of payables which are there, and I think the finance minister has repeatedly emphasized that she is asking, and she would ask all the concerned ministries, etc., to liquidate these payables, so that especially to the MSMEs, and I think this is at the moment being done. What we have suggested from Niti Aayog is a structural change, which is to say that let's shift from cash accounting to accrual accounting, so that the incentive to hold cash does not remain there with the government agencies and ministries. And once and for all, we would actually, in some sense, get over this whole system.
think there's always worry about the delivery gaps. There's another one again which arises out of the pillars you have identified, that you were saying government should focus on health and education, and you mentioned that only about 65% of our schools even have electrification. But back in 2018, the Modi government had claimed 100% electrification of this country. Again, that's a massive gap.
No, there's not. That's the electrification of villages, and that's been achieved. But the point is that does not.
If villages have electricity, schools won't.
But that will be the next step. No, that will be because you see the point. What I was pointing out at that stage was that there is dualism which is across the country in all aspects of our life, and we need to eliminate this dualism before we talk about other things and so on. Because, for example, if you talk about EdTech, education technology and hybrid and so on, we need to make sure that schools get electricity and get broadband connection. That is being now attempted. On the number that you talked about, we have been saying now, and I think it's recognized, that our statistical system, so that one time the best in the world, needs a thorough look. And I'm glad to say that the Ministry of Statistics and Plan Implementation is in the very process of doing that and revamping it and getting the new technology or the latest technology to try and make sure that you have a statistical system which is both credible, consistent, and timely. So I can assure you that they are at it. I've been a part of that process of consultation and so on. So and you will see that in days to come, we will get over this system, this weakness which has crept into our statistical system and data, which at the moment everybody recognizes.
So, Rajiv, so far we've been sort of focusing on, the fallouts of the pandemic for India, its negative impacts. There's one question I've asked everyone that I've interviewed on Inquiry so far, and which is that, is there one big shift that's happened for you personally, having seen this big rupture?
I've had to question myself and reimagine my understanding of urbanization. I think that's the one big impact that this has had, and that's led me to rethink in terms of the advantages of tall, congested spaces like Manhattan. Right. The theory was, and the experience so far was, that these very densely populated areas are the best for interaction of multi skills and many ideas, and therefore they gave rise to innovative thinking and creativity and so on. But I think that all of that now more and more and increasingly can happen in the cloud, and so you don't need that physical togetherness, if you like. Ideas can flow over Zoom rather than only over coffee. And therefore, that's led me to think that we need urbanization which is far more at peace and harmony with nature. I've started now reading, Kalam's work, on Pura, which is providing urban facilities to rural areas, and Gandhi's work, and then the experiment that Nanaji Deshmukh did in Chitrakoot, and also what's happening in Kerala, if you like. In Kerala, you don't really know where rural ends and urban begins. That's one big change that's happened to me.
One other question, that the Modi government has been very effective in some of the micro governance that it's delivered, the cylinders, the Jan Dhan accounts, the housing, toilets, and Jal Shakti mission. If it achieves what it has set out to achieve with Jal Shakti, that's fantastic. But as being a think tank of government, in the midterm and short term, what would be some of the new suggestions that you would focus on?
For me, the very big area is nutrition. I take this as a big blemish on our part, that after all these years, 70 years, at least 34, if not 38% of our kids are undernourished, which means that they don't even get the proper development of their brain, and 50% of our women are anemic. And this is not rocket science to solve that. And the Prime Minister is hugely focused on this. He's given me the responsibility for being the chair of this National Nutrition Council, and he is constantly reminding us that this is something that has to go. The second, of course, is preschool learning. and school learning, because again it's connected, in the sense of the future. We are focused a lot on school learning, Pratham and NAC and all of that, but children enter the school at the age of 6, and those who are first generation kid, they're already lost it, because they haven't had the sort of learning that all our kids have, and I think that creates the dualism in the society. And I personally believe that we should have universal, good quality public education, because the promise of every capitalist society is equality of opportunity.
Right.
And that equality of opportunity doesn't come about if you don't have universal public education of the highest quality. Every country, which I know of, has that as a. And going by the migrant labor, we discussed it before. Finally, of course, water. Real pity that in a country which is so blessed with monsoons, we could become large number of our districts become water stressed.
So one last question, Rajiv, as being an economist, and that everyone talks about this plateauing of demand that's happening. Do you see any other big macro change in thinking which will start, passing money more down to the bottom of the pyramid? Because
I don't for a minute believe in robbing the rich to pay the poor. If you focused on improving the living conditions and the working conditions of the 90% of your workforce, you would automatically bring the floor up. See, because that would mean that your real wage will have to rise. You'll have to give them a better living wage, housing, workers' housing. We are probably one of the few countries which doesn't have any idea of workers' housing. We've gone the Reagan-Thatcher route, while Germany and UK and China and Japan all have workers' housing. So if you give them that, if you give them, sort of some minimal social security and retraining, etc., all that floor would go up. This is exactly what happened in China. After the 1985 Deng Xiaoping revolution, this is exactly what's happened.
Do you see that shift happening, say, within government thinking? You're working in this collaboration.
Yes.
Because this can only happen out of government spending. It won't happen out of private investment.
Yes, actually, yes. Because, and I say this quite emphatically, because this is the sort of thing that is driving Ayushman Bharat. For the first time ever, you are getting 500 million people covered by medical insurance, so that the medical trauma doesn't push you back into poverty. It's never been done before. For example, Ujjwala. The fact of giving 120 million women, better life in the kitchen, so that they can also spend less time, etc. The Prime Minister's emphasis, actually, his emphasis on improving the delivery of public services, and not just merely give you rhetoric, which is what had happened for all that long, for 69 onwards, when you started Garibi Hatao, till now. Nothing was done. And that is what, by the way, was the thing which attracted me, very much to get into the government. Because I saw these things happening, and I saw the first 5 years actually laying the foundation for a less inequitable growth.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Just 2 points. One, I'd like your view on that there is this new sense of saying that nothing had happened for 60 or 70 years prior to the.
No, I don't believe that. I don't believe that.
That's a bit unfair, because it kind of also denigrates.
I don't believe that. But lots have happened. There's nothing wrong with that. But unfortunately, Shoma, I have to say that over the last 60, 65 years, we have created a very dualistic society. And a lot that has happened only for the top 10%. The elite have thrived, and not the real people. And I think we have to accept that.
Yeah, no, the only, again, being Indian makes you schizophrenic, because there'll be a time when I'll be critiquing it. But I think it's also important to remember that we inherited such a feudal, poor, illiterate colonial society, and a lot has happened, So when one takes these maximalist positions, it kind of undoes, the social mobility, the fact.
I don't ever take that position. After all, I was a part of the Dr. Manmohan Singh's government. I was the economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance. So I've seen the kind of changes that were made at that time, and for very good effect. So I of course cannot say that. But but one has to recognize also the fact that the elite has hogged it all, and we have actually, in some sense, given short shrift not only to our poor but also to nature. What have we done? Where have we come to? So it's been a very self-centered, very selfish kind of growth that we have seen. And I say this very often, which is that we have tried to find in the last so many years private solutions to public problems. And that's been the bane. Don't get a good education, go away, children, go abroad. That's what's now has to change.
There are lots of positive thoughts there, Rajiv, and more power to you on those ones. You mentioned nature, very, very important. Again, the pandemic has shown us the importance of climate change and nature. But there, Rajiv, I would ask you a straight up question, which is that does government share your thinking on that? And
yes.
Because there's been concern about the environmental clearances happening on Zoom calls, and a lot of roads going through sanctuaries. There doesn't seem to be that consciousness in government.
Don't buy that. You have to distinguish, and this is again an elitist problem. Because the elite is having it so good, they don't give a damn about development. It doesn't matter to them. Employment doesn't matter to them. If an industry can be stalled for saving whatever, but let me sort of, let me not give it because we must.
Please.
But the point is that the bleeding heart types, don't bleed enough for human beings. And that's a must. Because a lot of nature, maybe it's more and more difficult now, but a lot of nature, as we have seen since the Second World War, can be retrofitted. Human beings can't be.
That's true, Rajiv. But the only thing I'll say in this, that I've done the journalism on ground, that very often when we speak in the name of the poor, which is the disenfranchised, I don't even like to use the word poor, that you do development projects for them, but all the communities that live around that development project, in fact, are the worst impacted. And I'll give Singrauli as the biggest example. It's the biggest power hub in Asia. And every single big company is there. And yet, when you look at the communities there, they're thrice disenfranchised, and living in arsenic,
I understand what you're saying, but it's not necessary that it happens.
Absolutely. But is that paradigm shift happening is what.
No, but that is because we, the elite, you and I, would stop that project rather than make sure that the negative externalities are minimized. Right, which we can do if you were a society working together, and if you were on the same page. I've had this thing about Miss Medha Patkar all the time. To stop Narmada water to go to Saurashtra, and the people who were displaced, each one of them could have been given a much better life if you had only compromised on the fact, look, they may have to move 100 kilometers, but no, it has to be done there. And it has to be satyagraha. We can make that project go 40 years longer. Why? The same thing you find in Northeast today.
Yeah, but the Dibang Valley, very, very rich ecosystems. There are anxieties about that. And I would actually just leave us with one thought, Rajiv, that with this kind of new consciousness, can projects be designed better with enlightened consciousness?
They should be designed better. They have to be designed better. Because I actually now say that we don't have the luxury of retrofitting. And it's a fact, by the way, that Indians have never had a tradition of conquering nature. But, the key is that if one notices a project being designed not well, intervene at the very beginning and work with the people to design it better, rather than start calling names and pointing fingers and taking it to the Supreme Court, which will then just mean everything goes back a number of years. For now, I think it's critical that all stakeholders in the society come together and work together. That you please become our feedback mechanism. come to us, tell us where you're going wrong. This adversarial relationship that is developed over time. Why should we call them NGOs? Why shouldn't we call them development partners? And Gandhigiri is not adversarial. That's the whole idea. When he talked about capitalists being the trustees, he had something going on. Gandhi actually is a saint for the 21st century. And we should read him a bit more carefully.
I'd love us to end on a hopeful note, which is that, again, when you were talking about the big takeaway from the pandemic, is that you were envisioning a kind of almost Scandinavian welfare state for India. So far, the private sector has seen that as doles, as charity, as unproductive. What would be the takeaway you'd say about the importance of a welfare state?
The importance of the welfare state is that there is no other option. There is no other option. And for that, I think, while on the one hand, the government has to become more accountable, transparent, efficient, the private sector has to start thinking beyond the bottom line and actually start adopting the triple bottom line that Yogi Deveshwar talked about with such passion, and which is now converting into a movement in the US under the name of conscious capitalism. So for God's sakes, give up the idea of the Adam Smithian, Ricardian capitalism. That was for the 18th century. We're now in the 21st century. In the 18th century, they didn't want women in the boardrooms, but now we have them, right? So, if the private sector starts thinking on those lines, and just thinking just beyond oneself and thinking for the society, why can't I get a fraction % less of my quarterly return if that made my workers happier? There are enough examples in this country itself to show that model is more sustainable. And Scandinavia, he knows Delhi bahut durast.
That's a wonderful note to end on, Rajiv. And thank you. It's about sharing wealth, not robbing the rich for the poor, but sharing it more equitably. Because
voluntarily, and not by fiat. Yes. Good. Sorry.
Thank you.
You must say the last word.
The last word. No, yes. I already said it, that I'm very, very grateful for you for both fielding critical questions as well as putting out a positive vision that one can participate in and feel hopeful about. So thank you, Rajiv.